In the blinding snowstorm, a trembling child is abandoned in the freezing woods. Just as fragile steps falter, a pair of glowing eyes emerge from the darkness, not a predator, but an unexpected savior. This story unveils betrayal, pain, and the extraordinary power of love, where darkness is torn apart by unwavering loyalty. Click. Subscribe to the channel now to not miss any dramatic and emotional episodes from us. The city of Chicago had fallen silent beneath a storm that seemed intent on swallowing it whole. Wind whipped down the avenues, carrying shards of ice like razors, grinding against glass, steel, and brick. The skyline, usually alive with traffic, neon, and movement, had been reduced to shadows, half buried beneath a blanket of snow. At this hour, few dared to remain on the roads. It was the kind of night where breath crystallized the moment it left the lips, where every step was an act of defiance against the elements. Dr. Ethan Miller kept both hands firm on the steering wheel of his aging Subaru, the heater rattling but failing to keep the cabin warm. His eyes, bloodshot from a 16-hour shift at the hospital, blinked slowly, forcing themselves to stay focused on the slick black asphalt ahead. The wipers dragged across his windshield with a monotonous squeal, smearing the falling snow more than clearing it. Each blink felt heavier than the last. He told himself just 10 more minutes. 10 minutes to his apartment. 10 minutes to silence. But then, cutting through the rhythm of tires against ice and the groan of the engine, there came something he could not explain. A sound so fragile it seemed impossible it could carry over the roar of the storm. A cry. Ethan's brow furrowed. He turned down the volume of the radio, instinctively, though nothing was playing. The cry came again, faint, high-pitched, and filled with an unmistakable tremor. Not the sharp cry of a cat, not the squeal of wind. It was the sound every pediatrician knew, in their bones the desperate wail of an infant. He eased his foot off the gas, scanning the street. His headlights caught only the furious dance of snowflakes, whirling like ash in a gale. The city was deserted, shuttered storefronts, empty bus stops, the skeletal branches of trees trembling under the weight of snow. He told himself he must be imagining it. Fatigue could do that. He'd seen hallucinations before during long nights in the ER, when exhaustion made shadows move where they shouldn't. Then the cry pierced through again, louder, sharper. Ethan's chest tightened. His knuckles whitened against the wheel. He pulled over, tires crunching against the icy curb. The car idled in protest, engine grumbling. He cracked the window, letting in a blade of freezing air. His breath fogged instantly. But now, there was no doubt the sound was real. Somewhere in the white blur of the storm, a baby was crying. Ethan shoved the gear shift into park and grabbed his coat from the passenger seat. The zipper caught halfway, but he yanked it closed, throwing the hood over his head. The wind bit through his clothes the moment he opened the door, slamming against him with fists of ice. He squinted against it, scanning the darkened alleyway beside him, the snow-choked sidewalk stretching ahead, and then he saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape pressed against the side of a dumpster, half buried in drifting snow. A discarded box soaked through and sagging under the weight of ice. Nothing about it should have stood out. But from within its crumpled edges came the sound again, faint, strangled, almost lost to the wind. Ethan's boots crunched as he stumbled forward, heart racing. He bent over the box, his gloved hands brushing away clumps of snow. What he uncovered turned his stomach to ice. A baby girl no more than a few days old. Skin flushed, a dangerous shade of purple lips, trembling fists weakly clenched. She was wrapped in nothing but a thin hospital blanket, damp and useless against the storm. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, each breath a fragile miracle. But she was not alone. Ethan froze when his eyes locked with another pair, glinting, unblinking, fierce. A German shepherd, lean and snow-dusted, curled tightly around the infant. Her body pressed against the baby's tiny frame, shielding it from the storm. Frost clung to her fur, her flanks heaving with exhaustion. Yet her gaze was razor-sharp, her ears alert. The dog growled low and guttural, a warning that vibrated through the storm. Ethan's breath caught. For a moment, he dared not move. He had seen protective dogs before patients brought into the ER after bites their owners swearing the animal had never done such a thing. But this was different. This wasn't aggression born of confusion. It was defense. Pure primal defense. Easy. Ethan whispered, voice nearly drowned by the wind. He raised his hand slowly, palms open. I'm not here to hurt her. I'm here to help. The shepherd's growl deepened. Her body shifted, curling tighter around the infant muscles, taut despite her trembling. The baby cried again, weaker now, and the dog turned her head, licking the child's cheek with a tenderness that made Ethan's throat ache. He lowered himself to his knees, ignoring the bite of ice against bone. She won't survive long out here, he said softly, almost pleading with the animal. Neither of you will. Let me take you in, please. The wind howled through the alley, rattling a loose sign overhead. Ethan flinched, instinct tugging at him to move faster. Time was not on their side, but he forced himself to stay calm to meet those piercing eyes without fear. He saw intelligence in them, pain too, loyalty forged in fire. The shepherd's growl faded to a rumble, her ears twitching. Snow clung to her muzzle and she shivered violently. But she did not attack when Ethan reached forward, pulling the damp blanket tighter around the infant. His gloves brushed against the baby's icy skin, and a surge of panic shot through him. Hypothermia had already set in. Seconds mattered. I'm taking her, Ethan murmured. And you're coming too. He slid his arms beneath the baby, lifting her gently from the box. Her tiny body sagged against him, but a weak cry confirmed she still fought. Ethan tucked her inside his coat, cradling her against his chest, sharing what little warmth he had. The shepherd lunged half an inch forward, teeth bared, then stopped. She studied him, head tilted, nostrils flaring as if measuring his intent. Ethan held her gaze. Come on, he urged, voice raw. She needs you. I can't do this alone. The shepherd hesitated. Then with a low whine, she stepped out of the box paws, sinking into the snow. She moved stiffly as though every muscle ached from hours of holding still. But she stayed close, circling Ethan and the child, as if claiming them as her own. Relief flooded through him. He adjusted the baby in his coat, shielding her face from the wind, and rose to his feet. The alley stretched long and empty, but his car idled at the curb, a beacon in the storm. Each step back felt like dragging through cement. Snow lashed at his face. Wind clawed at his coat, but he pressed forward, the shepherd pacing beside him. The baby's faint cries echoed in his chest, a reminder of the stakes with every heartbeat. When Ethan finally shoved the car door open, warmth spilled out like a fragile promise. He slid into the driver's seat, clutching the infant close, while the shepherd leapt into the back seat without hesitation. She shook violently, sending a spray of melting snow across the upholstery, then settled with her eyes fixed on the baby. Ethan slammed the door shut, his breath ragged. The car's heater roared to life, blasting them with stale warmth. He peeled back the blanket just enough to check the baby's color, still dangerously pale. He fumbled for his phone, fingers numb, dialing the hospital's emergency line. This is Dr. Ethan Miller, he barked the moment the dispatcher answered. I've got an abandoned newborn in critical condition. Severe hypothermia. I'm en route. Prep neonatal ICU now. The dispatcher asked questions, but Ethan barely registered them. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, locking onto the shepherd. She sat rigid, gaze unwavering, ears perked despite her exhaustion. Snow melted in rivulets down her fur, but she didn't look away from the child. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He didn't know who would abandon a baby like this, or why this dog had chosen to become its guardian. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was no coincidence. This was the beginning of something far larger, far darker than anything he had expected when he'd left the hospital that night. And whatever storm awaited them beyond these streets, they were in it together. He pressed the accelerator. The car surged forward into the blizzard, carrying a doctor, a newborn, and a dog bound together by fate. The hospital corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic, a sterile coldness that mirrored the night outside. Snow still howled against the windows, Chicago gripped in the iron fist of a blizzard. But within the emergency unit, a different kind of storm raged, one of urgency, breathless determination, and the fragile thread of life dangling between existence and silence. Ethan Miller stood just outside the neonatal ward, his pulse pounding as if he had run miles. The image was still seared in his mind. The cardboard box, the tiny body curled inside, skin bluing from the cold, and Luna the German shepherd guarding it with the kind of loyalty that defied reason. Even now, as doctors and nurses rushed around, Ethan couldn't shake the sight of that animal chest rising with heavy breaths, eyes blazing with warning, yet refusing to abandon the child for even a heartbeat. Inside the ward, a team worked around the infant. Warm blankets, oxygen, gentle hands pressing against a chest no bigger than a man's palm. The room hummed with machines' monitors beeping erratically, then finding a tentative rhythm as the baby's lungs began to fight back against the cold. Ethan's throat tightened. He had seen resuscitations before. He had witnessed loss and revival countless times as a physician. But this was different. This was personal in a way he hadn't expected, an invisible thread pulling him toward that tiny girl, as though fate had carved her directly into his path. Luna lay sprawled just outside the glass, her body stretched protectively across the threshold, nose against the tile ears, twitching at every sound. Hospital staff had tried to move her, but Ethan stopped them with a simple shake of his head. "She stays," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced argument. Somehow everyone understood this dog wasn't just an animal wandering into a human mess. She was part of the story, part of the fight. Then it happened. A sound so fragile it could have broken if anyone breathed too hard a cry. Thin, tremulous, but alive. The baby's chest expanded, air filled her tiny lungs, and the heart monitor steadied into a rhythm that sang like music to Ethan's ears. Nurses exchanged glances of relief. Someone muttered, "She's coming back." Ethan felt his knees weaken. He pressed a palm to the glass eyes, burning. The cry drifted into the corridor, and Luna lifted her head. Her ears perked, tail brushing once against the floor. She didn't bark, didn't whine. She only listened, a low, almost reverent rumble deep in her chest, as if she understood that the fight was won for now. Hours later, when the chaos had quieted and the baby slept swaddled in warmth, Ethan sat in the quiet lounge across from the ward. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but his mind refused rest. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he'd heard that faint wail in the snow. If he had driven by a minute later, if he had ignored the sound, if the storm had been worse, the thought sickened him. A nurse approached softly, holding a clipboard. "Dr. Miller, we'll need a name for the chart," she said. "At least something temporary until social services assigns one." Ethan hesitated. The baby's mother was unknown, her story a void. For now, this child was a blank space with a heartbeat. His gaze flicked toward the window where snow still swept past in violent waves. And then the words surfaced unbidden, yet certain. "Hope," he said. His voice was hushed, almost reverent. "Call her Hope." The nurse smiled faintly, jotting it down. "Hope Miller for now." She confirmed, then disappeared into the ward. Ethan whispered the name to himself, tasting it, feeling the way it seemed to fit like a fragile promise. Hope. That was what this child had been left with in that alley. That was what Luna had fought to preserve. And maybe Ethan thought that was what he himself had been missing for far too long. Because deep inside, her cry had stirred something buried, memories he had locked away, grief he had tried to silence. He saw his wife's face again, soft in lamplight, laughing at nothing. He saw his son's small hands gripping a toy truck, cheeks flushed with joy. He saw the twisted wreckage of the accident that had stolen them both 3 years ago. His life since had been a husk, a routine performed without soul, just survival disguised as professionalism. And now, this child had pierced through all of it. When he lifted his eyes again, Luna was staring at him. She hadn't moved from her post. Her gaze was steady, almost unnervingly human. For a moment, Ethan felt as if the dog were testing him, measuring whether he was worthy of the trust she had placed in him by letting him carry the baby away from that alley. Slowly, cautiously, he knelt, extending his hand. "Thank you," he whispered, voice breaking. "You saved her life." Luna sniffed his fingers, then rested her head against his palm with a sigh that seemed to release hours of tension. The bond sealed itself in that fragile moment, an unspoken pact between man and animal. They were guardians now, together for as long as it took. The following morning, the story broke across Chicago. Local news channels ran headlines with urgency: "Hero dog protects abandoned newborn during blizzard." Clips showed Luna being led through the hospital doors, flurries clinging to her coat, and journalists spoke in awed tones about the miracle of survival. For once, the city found a story not of crime or corruption, but of loyalty and sacrifice. In the cafeteria, staff clustered around screens. Some cried openly, others shook their heads in disbelief. Ethan stood apart, arms folded, feeling the swell of public attention, like a wave threatening to crash down on something fragile. He hadn't wanted attention. He had only wanted to keep a child alive. But maybe he thought this exposure was necessary proof to the world that faith could be reborn in the unlikeliest of places. By afternoon, donations began flooding the hospital, people sending baby clothes, formula tiny knitted hats. Letters poured in addressed simply to Hope. Strangers wrote messages of love prayers for her future gratitude to the unknown heroes who had saved her. Ethan read a few and found himself choking up again. Humanity, for all its cruelty, still carried sparks of grace. But beneath the noise of praise and attention, Ethan felt something more intimate. Every time he stepped into the ward, Hope's tiny fist curled instinctively, as if searching for someone to hold. And every time Luna stirred ears, twitching eyes, never leaving the glass, as if reminding him, "She is not alone. We are here." It was in one of those quiet intervals late that evening that Ethan found himself standing by Hope's crib. Machines beeped softly, casting a rhythm like a lullaby. He reached a finger into her palm, and the reflexive grip closed around him with surprising strength. He froze breath, catching as tears burned hot against his lashes. "Hope," he whispered. "You don't even know me, but you've already changed everything." Behind him, Luna exhaled a low, steady sigh and curled tighter against the doorframe sentinel and companion. Ethan knew in that instant that the three of them were bound together. This wasn't just medicine. This wasn't just chance. This was the beginning of something none of them could yet name: a family stitched together by circumstance, by tragedy, and by the possibility of redemption. And though the storm outside still roared, within the fragile quiet of that hospital, warmth had returned. The warmth of breath, of heartbeat, of a future reclaimed. The hospital glowed like a beacon against the storm, its windows lit with sterile fluorescence that spilled across the snow-covered parking lot. Inside, warmth and life pulsed: a newborn, recovering, a dog resting as guardian, and a man rediscovering a piece of himself. But outside, on the edge of that fragile circle of light, someone stood cloaked in shadow. Grace Turner. Her coat was too thin for the biting February wind, and her face was gaunt cheeks hollowed by sleepless nights. Strands of hair clung to her damp cheeks, plastered there by melting snow. She pulled the hood closer, but it could not hide the trembling of her lips, nor the way her eyes, wide-haunted, remained fixed on a single floor of the building. The neonatal ward. She had heard. News spread faster than blizzards in Chicago. A baby abandoned in the storm, miraculously saved. A dog hailed as a hero, people cheering, people celebrating. Grace couldn't escape the headlines: "Guardian angel with fur saves child from certain death." Her hands shook as she folded the crumpled newspaper tighter into her pocket. Her child, every syllable of those words burned her. She had carried the baby for months, every kick and turn inside her belly, an echo of the life she had once dreamed would redeem her. But when the time came, when the weight of the world pressed against her ribs and conscience, she had faltered. She had left that child in the alley, wrapped in the last thing she could afford, a threadbare blanket that smelled faintly of her tears. And now from the shadows, she watched strangers save what she could not. Her knees threatened to buckle. She pressed against the icy steel of a lamppost for balance. A single thought screamed in her mind. Go to her. Tell them she is yours. Reclaim her before the world steals her away. But then another voice, darker, stronger, rose to choke her. They will hate you. They will spit on you. They will call you a monster for what you did. They already do. The weight of her shame pressed down heavier than the snow. She remembered when things had been different. Not long ago, though, it felt like lifetimes. Grace had been a student at Northwestern's medical school. She had loved the smell of textbooks, the adrenaline of long nights, memorizing anatomy charts, the thrill of imagining herself in white coat and stethoscope. She had wanted to heal, to build a life that would rise above the poverty she had been born into. But dreams can shatter with one mistake. She had fallen in love, or thought she had, with a resident whose charm had been quicksand. Promises whispered in dim dorm hallways, careless laughter under the library's fluorescent lights. Then came silence, abandonment, and the truth that she was carrying his child. At first she had convinced herself she could still make it work, school the baby a future. But the system doesn't forgive women like Grace. Professors whispered behind her back. Classmates stopped inviting her to study groups. Financial aid evaporated. The slow collapse of her world had been unbearable. Each day she grew heavier, not just in body, but in despair. Until she found herself alone, jobless, expelled from school, sleeping on couches, then shelters. And then the night the contractions came early, she panicked. She had no family, no money, no future. All she had was the child and the fear that she could not possibly provide. So she chose the unthinkable. She chose to walk away. Now, as she watched the hospital where her daughter breathed and lived, the choice strangled her. Inside, people saw a miracle. Outside, she lived as a ghost. Grace pulled her coat tighter. She saw reporters gathering at the front entrance, cameras trained on anyone walking through. Their excitement was feverish. A hero dog, a miracle baby, a city aching for hope in the middle of its coldest winter in decades. And she, the mother, was invisible, no worse than invisible. She was the villain in their narrative. She imagined the headlines. If she stepped forward, monster mother abandons infant in blizzard. They would never ask why. They would never see the layers of fear, of brokenness, of loss. They would only see the act, the image of a shivering child left to die. Her hands trembled as she lit a cigarette, even though the nicotine always burned her throat. She inhaled hard, as if smoke could fill the emptiness, gnawing inside her. Every puff reminded her she was still alive, though she barely felt it. Her gaze drifted upward again toward the window, where she knew her daughter slept. The faint reflection of lights shimmered against the glass. For a fleeting second, she imagined the child's face, the tiny nose, the small mouth curling into cries. Grace's arms ached with phantom weight, remembering how it had felt to hold her for the first time in that freezing alley. She had kissed her forehead. She had whispered an apology she could never take back. Inside the ward, the city adored a dog. Luna was sainted, photographed, fed treats by strangers. Grace couldn't falter. The dog had done what she herself couldn't. But the bitter irony clawed at her society, lifted the animal as a savior, while condemning her, the human mother, as nothing more than a criminal. She exhaled smoke into the storm. Her chest heaved. The choice loomed like a blade suspended above her. To walk inside, to confess, to hold her child again and face the wrath of the world, or to remain hidden, to bury the truth and let hope grow up, believing her mother never existed. Her conscience tore her apart. One side whispered redemption. You can explain. You can beg forgiveness. People will despise you, but at least your daughter will know the truth. The other hissed self-preservation. Stay silent. She is better off without you. You only bring ruin. Walk away and disappear forever. Grace pressed her forehead to the cold glass of the bus stop shelter. She closed her eyes and memories poured through the sound of a lecture hall chalk squeaking across board the laughter of her classmates. The first flutter she felt in her belly that night in the library, when she realized life had already changed. And then the last look she gave her baby before setting her down, whispering, "I love you." "I'm sorry." The apology hadn't been enough. Nothing ever would. Snow gathered in her hair. Her cigarette burned to a stub, dropped into the slush at her feet. She dug her nails into her palms, drawing faint lines of pain, grounding herself. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted to hold her child until the world stopped spinning. Instead, she remained still, frozen between light and darkness, while the city around her celebrated a story they thought they understood. Grace Turner was the missing piece no one saw. The silent shadow just beyond the glow of cameras. The woman torn apart by love, by fear, by shame. And the question that would haunt her again and again was simple, brutal, relentless. Do I claim her, or do I disappear? The snow fell heavier. The hospital windows blurred. And Grace remained trembling in the storm, carrying the unbearable weight of a choice that might define the rest of her life. Richard Collins's penthouse towered above the city, like a citadel, all glass and steel reflecting the skyline back onto itself. Inside, the world smelled of leather whiskey and freshly printed financial reports. It was a fortress of success, curated to project power efficiency, untouchable control. Yet tonight, as snow lashed against the windows and the television screen glared with breaking news, that carefully constructed facade trembled. Richard's hand gripped the tumbler so tightly that the glass threatened to crack. On the screen, an anchor spoke with breathless excitement. A miraculous survival in Chicago tonight. An infant abandoned in a blizzard has been saved by a stray dog. Doctors say the baby girl is in stable condition. The city is calling it a miracle, a story of hope, in the midst of this brutal winter. Images followed grainy footage of the alley. The blanket the rescue workers, the dog with its muzzle dusted white from snow. And then a photograph taken hastily through hospital glass of the infant swaddled in fresh linens, her face small but unmistakably alive. Richard's breath hitched. He set the glass down with too much force. Whiskey sloshed across the polished wood of his desk, dripping onto papers that bore the Collins Corporation logo. His pulse thudded at his temples. He pressed both palms flat on the desk, leaned forward, and whispered through clenched teeth, "God damn it." The room felt too small, the air suffocating. For years he had believed this chapter buried a secret folded away into the dark corners of his past where light would never reach. Grace Turner. The mistake, the liability, the reminder of everything reckless was supposed to be gone. She had vanished after the scandal at school. And the child Richard had convinced himself it had never survived. But there it was alive, its very existence flashing across every news outlet in the city. His empire, built on precision and perception, teetered on the edge of exposure. Richard Collins wasn't just a wealthy man. He was the man behind Collins Biotech, a corporation worth billions, with government contracts, pharmaceutical patents, and shareholders who believed in the image of a visionary leader. He had spent decades cultivating the persona of a family man, philanthropist, and ruthless but respectable executive. And now, with one news story that carefully polished mask was at risk of shattering. Because the child was his, he paced the length of the office shoes, striking the marble floor in sharp echoes. His reflection followed him across the glass windows, a tall, broad-shouldered man, silver, streaking his temples, jaw carved from years of tight control. But his eyes betrayed him, flickers of panic he could not contain. He snatched the remote and killed the television. Silence roared in its wake. For a moment he let himself imagine the fallout. The tabloids would feast business mogul's illegitimate child found abandoned in blizzard. Investors would panic, board members would whisper about replacement, political allies would withdraw support. His wife, already brittle with suspicion, would demand blood. Every enemy he had crushed in his climb to the top would smell weakness and circle like vultures. Richard Collins could not allow that. He sat down, pressed his fingers together into a steeple, and forced his breathing into control. Panic was a weakness. Control was his weapon. He had faced crises before: lawsuits, hostile takeovers, rumors of corruption. He had always silenced them, buried them, outspent them. This would be no different. But this wasn't just a rumor. This was flesh and blood. Grace Turner. Her name tasted like acid in his mouth. He remembered her sharp-minded, ambitious eyes, too bright for someone from nothing. She had been useful once, until she wasn't. She had wanted more from him than he was willing to give. And when the pregnancy came, he had cut her loose, brutally, decisively. He had told her she would ruin them both. He had assumed she would take care of the problem, disappear into the shadows where broken women go. But she hadn't. She had carried the child. And now somehow both had resurfaced. Richard opened his desk drawer and pulled out a burner phone. He had one for every possible crisis, each tied to shell companies and disposable accounts. He dialed a number, his voice steady-clipped. "It's Collins. I need eyes on someone. Grace Turner. She's in the city. Find her." Quietly. The voice on the other end was gravely detached. A man who didn't ask questions. Understood. "And listen carefully," Richard added, his tone tightening like a garrote. "No mistakes. No noise. I want her watched every move, every breath. If she's anywhere near that hospital, I want to know before she takes another step." He ended the call and leaned back, exhaling slowly. The machinery was in motion. He had dealt with threats before. The difference this time was that the threat wasn't a rival corporation or a political scandal. It was his own past clawing back to the surface. He poured another drink, hands steadier now. As the whiskey burned down his throat, his mind sharpened. Grace wouldn't dare reveal herself openly. He knew her shame, her weakness. But shame could turn into desperation, and desperation was unpredictable. If she tried to claim the child, if she stepped into the spotlight, everything would unravel. Richard could not let her speak. He walked to the window, staring out at the city spread below him like a chessboard. Snow blurred the skyline, but he saw only possibilities, strategies. Every crisis was a game of control, contain, misdirect, eliminate. Grace Turner was not just a ghost from the past. She was now a liability, a ticking bomb. And bombs were meant to be diffused or destroyed. Somewhere beneath his anger, something colder flickered: fear. Not fear of Grace herself, but of what she represented. A crack in his image. A truth he had spent years constructing walls to keep out. He hated that she still had power, even indirectly. He hated that his child existed beyond his control, beyond the confines of the family he had chosen to present to the world. Control was everything to Richard Collins, and now control was slipping. He pressed his forehead to the glass, watching the faint glow of the hospital in the distance. That building, that ward, contained the embodiment of everything he had tried to bury. The child was alive. And with her, the possibility that the world might finally see Richard Collins, not as the titan he claimed to be, but as what he truly was, a man built on lies, betrayal, and shadows. The storm outside howled. His reflection in the window looked back at him, a man haunted not by enemies, but by his own blood. And for the first time in years, Richard Collins felt something he could not buy: silence or bury. He felt hunted. The hospital at night was a world suspended between light and shadow. Hallways hummed with low fluorescent glow. Nurses moved in practiced silence, and snow tapped against the windows like a relentless metronome. In the neonatal ward, the miracle child, still unnamed, slept beneath the protective hum of monitors, her tiny chest rising and falling, as if she carried the weight of two worlds, the one that had abandoned her and the one fighting to claim her. Grace Turner lingered in the corridor, her face half hidden beneath the hood of her coat. Her eyes, hollow from years of regret, clung to the glass window that separated her from the infant. She hadn't meant to come this close. She had promised herself she would stay in the shadows. But the pull was irresistible. Blood called to blood, an invisible tether dragging her forward until her palms pressed against the glass. On the other side of the nursery, the baby stirred her tiny fingers, twitching as though sensing something. Grace's throat constricted. She whispered without sound, lips trembling. My daughter. Every nerve screamed to rush inside to hold the child, to claim what had been stolen from her by time, shame, and fear. But she couldn't. She had no right not after the choices she'd made. She was a ghost in her own story, condemned to watch from behind the barrier. Then came the voice. Low, sharp, laced with suspicion. You. Grace froze. The syllables sliced the air like a blade. Slowly she turned. Ethan Hayes stood at the end of the hallway, his frame rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with barely contained fury. He had been keeping vigil since the night of the rescue, a silent guardian at the hospital, unwilling to let the child out of his sight. Now, catching sight of Grace, something in him snapped. His boots struck the linoleum floor as he approached, each step echoing with judgment. You have some nerve showing up here. Grace swallowed her mouth dry. Don't. His voice rose enough to draw the glance of a passing nurse, though she quickly averted her eyes and continued down the hall. Ethan stopped just short of her, towering with the righteous anger of a man who had nearly watched an innocent life extinguished in the snow. He jabbed a finger toward the nursery window. That little girl almost died out there. Alone. Buried in the cold. Do you even know what that means? Do you even care? Grace flinched as if struck. The words weren't unfamiliar. She had repeated them to herself countless times in the years since. You left her. You failed her. But hearing them from someone else, spoken with venom and disbelief, carved her open in a way nothing else had. Her eyes shimmered, but she forced herself to stand to hold his gaze. You don't understand. Don't I? Ethan barked. His voice echoed through the corridor, sharp enough to make the baby stir behind the glass. He noticed, lowered his volume, but his intensity remained. I was there. I carried her out of that alley, half frozen, fighting for her life. And where were you? Grace's lips parted, but no sound came. Her body trembled, the dam of silence threatening to burst. Ethan leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper. What kind of mother walks away from her own child? What kind of monster? Stop! The word came not from Grace, but from the small, clear voice behind them. Both turned. Luna stood in the hallway, clutching a stuffed rabbit against her chest, her eyes wide but fierce. No one had noticed her slip from her room. Her gaze went first to Ethan, then to Grace. She didn't know the details, couldn't possibly, but children saw through shadows adults tried to hide. Don't talk to her like that, Luna said softly, yet with an authority that startled them both. She's not a monster. The silence that followed was heavy. Ethan's shoulders stiffened, his jaw working, as if wrestling with invisible chains. Grace, meanwhile, staggered backward, her knees nearly giving way. Sweetheart, she whispered, though she didn't dare say more. Luna stepped closer, her small presence cutting through the storm of judgment. She tilted her head, studying Grace with uncanny perception, as though reading the truth etched into her face. She's sad, Luna murmured. Sad all over. Ethan's chest heaved. His protective instincts collided with the possibility that Luna was right, that the woman before him wasn't just neglect, but tragedy incarnate. Still, his anger wouldn't let go so easily. She abandoned her, Ethan growled. Don't defend her. Luna hugged her rabbit tighter, her voice trembling but steady. Sometimes, people don't mean to hurt. Sometimes the world makes them. Grace broke, her back pressed against the wall as sobs tore through her chest. Years of silence, of carrying the weight of shame alone, collapsed under the weight of a child's mercy. She slid down until she sat on the cold floor, covering her face with trembling hands. I didn't want to, she choked. I never wanted to leave her. You don't know what they did to me. You don't know what he did to me. Ethan blinked, the edge of his anger faltering. He crouched slightly, his eyes narrowing with cautious recognition. He who? Grace lowered her hands, revealing a face ravaged by grief. Richard Collins. The name dripped like poison into the air, and Ethan's gut twisted. Of course. Collins, untouchable mogul, a man who cast shadows long enough to swallow lives whole. The kind of man who left scars no one dared name. Grace's words tumbled out in broken fragments, her voice raw, confessional. I was young. I thought he loved me. I thought he believed in me. But when I told him about the baby, he... She shook her head violently, unable to complete the memory. He said I would ruin everything, that I was nothing. He told me to disappear. And I believed him. I believed I had no choice. The confession filled the corridor with a weight heavier than snow. Ethan stared, struggling between rage at her weakness and horror at the man who had orchestrated it. He thought of the baby inside that nursery, the fragile life caught in the crossfire of power and shame. Luna, quiet now, moved closer to Grace. She knelt, placing her small hand gently on the woman's shoulder. The contact was simple, yet it broke Grace further. She leaned into the child's touch as if it were the first kindness she had felt in years. I'm sorry, Grace whispered over and over like a prayer to no one. I'm so sorry. Ethan straightened his fists, clenching. His anger had nowhere to go, his certainty unraveling. He had wanted to see her as a villain, a heartless woman, unworthy of mercy. But now, seeing her crumble, hearing the truth, he realized the story was darker, more complicated, and far more dangerous. Because if Richard Collins was involved, then this wasn't just abandonment. It was conspiracy. Ethan's gaze returned to the glass, where the baby slept, oblivious to the storm raging outside her crib. His voice, when he spoke, was lower, steadier. If what you're saying is true, then she's not just in danger because of what happened in that alley. She's in danger because of him. Grace lifted her tear-streaked face eyes, searching his. He'll come for me. He'll come for her. He can't let the truth out. The truth hung between them, undeniable. Ethan looked at Grace, then at Luna, then at the fragile miracle behind the glass. A silent vow formed in him, a promise born not from duty, but from something deeper. He would not let Richard Collins win. For the first time, the three of them, Ethan, Grace, and Luna, were bound together not by blood, but by circumstance, by truth, by the fragile thread of survival. The fateful encounter had shattered illusions, exposed wounds, and ignited a fire none of them could yet comprehend. The storm outside raged on. Inside, a different storm had just begun. Under the cold, fluorescent glow of the hospital corridor, Ethan Miller leaned against the wall just outside the neonatal unit. His arms crossed his mind, a tangle of questions. Grace's confession still echoed in his ears, her trembling voice, her broken sentences, her shame laid bare. She hadn't abandoned her child out of cruelty. She had done it from despair, from being cornered by circumstances he could only imagine. And yet a sliver of doubt remained. He had seen so many people invent sob stories in his years, as a doctor weaving excuses to justify what seemed unforgivable. But there had been something raw in Grace's tears, something unpolished, unperformed. Inside the unit, the baby still called Hope. By the nurses slept soundly, her chest rising and falling in fragile rhythm. Luna lay stretched out on the floor just beyond the glass wall, her head resting on her paws, golden brown eyes never straying far from the infant. To Ethan, the dog seemed like a sentinel, a bridge between worlds, between innocence and betrayal, between the broken mother and the skeptical doctor. Grace had left the hospital that night under the cover of shadows, but not before Luna had done something Ethan couldn't ignore. When Grace had whispered her child's name, tears streaming down her face. Luna had risen, approached her cautiously, and pressed her head against Grace's trembling hand. It hadn't been the posture of defense nor rejection. It had been recognition, trust. Ethan couldn't shake the image. Dogs didn't lie. And if Luna had chosen to acknowledge Grace, what did that say about the truth buried beneath all the scandal? The following days unfolded like a storm that refused to settle. News outlets plastered the story across headlines: "Hero Dog Saves Baby in Blizzard." Photographs of Luna regal and calm beside the incubator went viral. Crowds began to gather outside the hospital, hoping to catch a glimpse of the unlikely heroine. Some brought flowers, Others homemade signs praising loyalty, resilience, and the miracle of survival. Yet woven into the admiration was venom. When whispers spread about Grace, her identity, her past as a promising medical student who had thrown her future away, the narrative split in two. Talk shows debated her motives. Was she a coward who had abandoned her child in the cold? Or a desperate young woman with no one left to turn to? Comment sections burned with cruelty. She doesn't deserve that baby. People like her are the reason children end up in foster care. Others defended her with equal passion. She tried to save her child the only way she knew how. Don't judge until you've lived her life. Ethan watched it all unfold with a tight jaw. His loyalty torn in two directions. As a physician, he knew the brutality of public opinion could crush a soul faster than any disease. Yet he also knew what it meant to stand in judgment, to demand accountability. Each time he tried to settle his stance, Luna's steady gaze seemed to pin him, as if challenging him to look deeper, to move past black and white thinking. One evening, Ethan found Grace standing in the hospital garden, wrapped in a threadbare coat. Snowflakes clung to her dark hair, her posture both fragile and defiant. She startled when she saw him, but didn't run this time. Their conversation unfolded in halting breaths. She spoke of the nights she had studied anatomy under dim lights, her ambition to heal her secret love affair with a man who had promised her the world only to vanish when responsibility loomed. She spoke of her parents' rejection, of the crushing silence that followed, of the terror of holding a newborn, while knowing she had no roof, no food, no hope. Her voice cracked when she admitted she believed the baby had a better chance of being found in the cold than in her arms. Ethan wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her it was madness, recklessness, near murder. But then he looked into her eyes and saw a woman who had been stripped of every safety net, every promise, every ounce of faith in herself. She hadn't stopped loving her child. She had stopped believing she deserved her. And that distinction pierced something deep in him. Luna padded forward, brushing against Grace's side, her fur collecting snow. The dog leaned gently into her, as if insisting she was not beyond redemption. Ethan felt his defenses falter further. He had lost his own family years ago, his wife to illness, his unborn child to complications that had ripped through his life like fire through dry wood. He knew the hollow echo of loss, the relentless question of what if. And now, staring at Grace, he recognized another survivor of grief, another soul staggering under unbearable weight. But outside their fragile circle, the world sharpened its claws. Paparazzi prowled the sidewalks. Reporters dug through archives, unearthing Grace's academic record, her connection to Richard Collins, whispered in half-verified leaks. Speculation mounted. Was the wealthy mogul her benefactor, her predator, or merely another casualty of rumor? Each article fueled the fire, dividing the city into factions, those who hailed Grace as a woman, wronged, and those who branded her irredeemable. Inside the hospital, Ethan felt the pressure of bureaucracy pressing in. Administrators urged him to distance himself to maintain neutrality. "You're not her savior," one colleague warned. "You're a doctor. Don't let her drag you into her chaos." Yet every time he walked past Hope's tiny crib, every time Luna's ears perked at the sound of Grace's footsteps, he felt the threads of destiny tightening, binding them together whether he wanted it or not. The choice loomed before him, clear and merciless. Keep Grace at arm's length, preserving his professional distance, or take a leap of faith that could cost him everything. His reputation, his career, perhaps even his safety, though he didn't yet know how close danger truly lurked. One night, as the snow fell heavier than before, Ethan returned to his small apartment. He found himself staring at the photograph of his late wife, her smile frozen in time. He whispered to her memory, confessing his doubts, his fear of caring too much again. Yet beneath the fear was a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. The baby's name wasn't an accident. It was a prophecy. Meanwhile, Grace walked the streets alone, headlines flashing on every screen she passed, her image distorted into caricature. She wanted to run, She wanted to disappear. But then she would remember the weight of her daughter's hand. In her dreams, the warmth of Luna's acceptance, the steadiness of Ethan's reluctant trust. That fragile thread kept her tethered. She couldn't abandon her child again, and so quietly, almost imperceptibly, an alliance began to form. Grace returned to the hospital not as a stranger lurking in shadows, but as a mother determined to reclaim her place. Ethan began to listen more, judge less. Luna stood between them, not as a wall, but as a bridge. And together, the three of them began to craft something resembling a family, even as the outside world circled like wolves in the snow. But the closer they drew, the more palpable the danger became. Ethan could feel it in the tightening of his gut, in the flicker of unfamiliar cars idling near the hospital, in the whispers of Grace's name spoken with venom by men in expensive suits. He didn't yet know the full scope of Richard Collins's reach, but he could sense the storm gathering just beyond the horizon. For now, though, in this fragile space of time, there was the baby's soft breathing, the dog's loyal presence, and the possibility of redemption. The fragile beginnings of family, the tenuous birth of trust, the flicker of hope against an encroaching darkness. The night the storm returned heavier and more relentless than before, the hospital seemed to shrink beneath the weight of silence. The corridors hummed with the low throb of fluorescent lights, machines breathed steady rhythms in the neonatal wing. And yet Ethan Miller couldn't shake the feeling that something malignant was pressing against the walls. He had lived long enough around trauma, both in the ER and in his private life, to recognize the subtle scent of danger before it materialized. That night, it was in the air, sharp, metallic, impossible to dismiss. Luna sensed it first. The German Shepherd had been lying on her side, her body angled protectively between Grace and the glass chamber that held the tiny infant, her ears twitching every few minutes. Suddenly, her head lifted. Her ears pricked. A low rumble grew in her throat, vibrating through the sterile quiet. Grace looked up from the rocking chair where exhaustion had folded her body in on itself. Ethan felt the shift too, the prickle at the base of his skull. Something wasn't right. The attack came swiftly, surgically planned. A security door at the far end of the ward cracked open, not with the normal hiss of a nurse swiping a badge, but with a muffled clink, metal tools working locks. Shadows slipped in 4 of them, broad-shouldered men dressed in dark tactical gear. They moved with purpose, cutting through the sterile corridor like predators. One carried a duffel bag. Another pulled out a silencer-suppressed pistol, the matte metal glinting faintly under the lights. Grace froze. Ethan's pulse surged. He didn't need introductions to know who had sent them. Richard Collins' fingerprints were all over this kind of operation, silent, ruthless, clinical. He wasn't going to let a scandal threaten his empire. The child wasn't a baby to him. She was leverage. She was silence. She was control. Grace? Ethan whispered, his hand gripping her arm. Take the baby. Now. But Luna was faster. She lunged to the doorway, planting herself between the intruders and the incubator, her body taut as a drawn bow. Her growl cut through the air like a blade, low and menacing. The men hesitated for the briefest of moments. Then everything exploded. The first intruder raised his weapon. Luna sprang forward, a blur of fur and muscle. Her jaws clamped down on his arm before he could aim, wrenching it sideways with a feral snarl. The silencer spat once, a muted thud, but the bullet ricocheted into the wall instead of flesh. Chaos erupted. Nurses screamed from down the hall. Alarms tripped. Ethan shoved Grace toward the crib, his voice a roar drowned beneath the sounds of violence. Pick her up. Grace stumbled, panic and adrenaline tangling her limbs. But her hands reached into the incubator, trembling as they wrapped around her daughter. For the first time since that fateful night in the snow, she held the baby close against her chest, and in that instant, terror roaring in her veins, she knew she could never let her go again. Luna fought with the ferocity of something far beyond instinct. The second intruder swung a baton, but the dog ducked and rammed into his knees, toppling him with a crash. The third tried to flank her, reaching for Grace, but Luna pivoted, snarling, forcing him back. The fourth managed to slip past just barely his gloved hand, stretching toward the bundle in Grace's arms. Ethan didn't think. He launched himself forward, a doctor turned into a shield. His shoulders slammed into the man's ribs, sending them both crashing into the supply cart. Surgical trays scattered instruments clattering across the floor. Ethan's breath burst out in ragged gasps as the intruder swung wildly, catching him across the jaw. Pain split white-hot, but Ethan held his ground, grappling with the stranger in a desperate, graceless brawl. Grace screamed, backing into the corner with her child clutched tight, eyes darting between Ethan and Luna, torn apart by helplessness. The baby wailed, the sound piercing, heartbreaking human. One of the men managed to wrench free long enough to snarl into his radio, "Target located, moving." His words cut short with another growl and a flash of teeth. Luna's jaws locked around his calf, dragging him down, buying precious seconds. Blood streaked across the sterile tiles, the smell of copper mixed with antiseptic. The fight stretched seconds into lifetimes. Ethan's fists split open against bone. Grace's cries blurred with the alarms wailing overhead. Somewhere someone had called security, but the intruders had calculated their window. They knew backup wouldn't arrive in time. Their orders were clear: get the baby out no matter the cost. But they hadn't accounted for Luna. The shepherd stood drenched in sweat and blood, her fur bristling like steel, her eyes blazing with something primal. She was no mere pet. She was guardian, soldier, lifeline. With one final guttural snarl, she launched herself at the intruder nearest Grace, her body slamming into him with enough force to hurl him back into the wall. His head cracked against tile, and he slumped unconscious. The remaining men faltered. They hadn't expected this level of resistance from a dog, from a doctor, from a woman they thought was broken. And in that hesitation, the battle shifted. Security stormed the hall. Weapons-drawn voices commanding the intruders to drop their arms. The men exchanged one glance. Their mission failed. Two retreated under cover of smoke grenades hurled from their duffel bag, choking the corridor with gray fog. The others crawled out, dragging the injured with them. In seconds, the ward was left a battlefield, broken equipment. Streaks of blood, Grace sobbing with her baby pressed tight. Ethan bent over with bruises swelling across his face, and Luna standing firm, chest heaving, her fur matted, but her eyes unwavering. It was over for now, but the message had been delivered. Later, when the smoke cleared and the police took statements, Ethan sat in the corner of the hospital room. His hand pressed against the gash in his lip, his mind racing. He stared at Grace, who hadn't stopped cradling her daughter since the moment the first intruder had appeared. There was no question anymore. This wasn't about judgment or redemption. This was war. Richard Collins had declared it without uttering a single word. And then Richard did speak. It was hours later, when the police presence thinned and silence settled once more. Ethan had stepped out into the snow-choked parking lot to breathe, to think, to stitch together some semblance of sense. A sleek black car rolled up to the curb, its tinted window sliding down with mechanical calm. Inside sat Richard Collins. Immaculate suit, cold eyes, a face carved from arrogance and certainty. He didn't bother with theatrics. His voice was measured, smooth as poison. "You've made a mistake, Dr. Miller." Ethan froze, every nerve taut. Richard leaned slightly forward, his gaze slicing through the icy air. "That woman, that child. They are liabilities." "Do you understand what I do with liabilities?" Ethan said nothing, jaw clenched, fists at his sides. Richard's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You think this is about family? About love? It's not. This is survival. And in survival, sentiment is weakness." His tone dropped lower, cutting. "Walk away, doctor, or you'll find yourself buried in the same snow that almost swallowed them." The window slid back up. The car rolled away into the storm, leaving Ethan standing alone in the swirl of white, his breath visible, his heartbeat, a drum in his chest. He understood now. There was no turning back. Grace hadn't just dragged him into a family crisis. She had pulled him into the jaws of a predator who would burn down anything in his path to keep his empire intact. And Ethan knew, with bone-deep certainty, this was no longer a question of whether Grace deserved a second chance. It was a question of whether any of them would survive what was coming. The hospital reeked of smoke, blood, and panic long after the intruders had vanished. Alarms still wailed in the background. Nurses darted through the corridors like frightened birds, and officers swarmed the entrance with weapons drawn. But Ethan Miller knew, with a grim certainty, that they weren't safe here, not anymore. The attack had been too precise, too deliberate. Richard Collins wouldn't stop because of failed henchmen or a police report. No wall, no badge, no uniform could shield Grace and the child now. He turned back toward the room where Grace sat huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped protectively around the tiny bundle of life that had nearly been stolen. Her face was pale, streaked with tears and exhaustion, but her grip was fierce. Hope squirmed against her chest, small whimpers rising from the baby's throat, each sound slicing into Ethan's nerves like glass. Luna stood rigid beside them, her chest-heaving eyes still burning with the feral vigilance that had saved them all. She hadn't moved from her guard post, as if daring the shadows to make another attempt. Ethan closed the door quietly and locked it, though he knew locks were nothing but symbols now. He crouched beside Grace. "We can't stay here." His voice was low, firm, threaded with urgency. "If they found us once, they'll find us again. Richard doesn't give up." Grace's eyes darted to his wide and wounded. "But this is a hospital. There are police everywhere. How could they possibly try again? They already did." Ethan snapped, then softened, catching the flinch that rippled through her. "Grace, this place is compromised. Maybe the police don't know it, maybe they don't want to admit it, but Richard has reach, money, influence. If he wants through those doors, he'll get through them. The only chance we have is to move before he strikes again." Silence stretched between them, thick with terror and mistrust. Grace rocked Hope gently, her lips trembling against the baby's forehead. "And where would we go? We can't just vanish." Ethan felt the bitter laugh clawing at his throat, but he swallowed it down. "We don't need to vanish. Just get far enough that Richard's men can't track us. There are places outside the city, backroads, cabins no one's used in years. We need to disappear before the next wave hits." Luna growled low as if punctuating his words. Her amber eyes flicked toward the door. Ethan's decision was made before Grace could argue. He reached for his jacket, stuffing his medical bag with essentials, bandages, painkillers, formula bottles, anything he could grab in seconds. His hands moved with the speed of instinct, though his chest hammered with dread. Grace finally spoke, her voice small but sharp. "Why are you doing this?" The question stopped him. He looked up, meeting her eyes, reading the tangle of suspicion there. "Because if we don't leave you and Hope are dead by morning, that's not what I meant." Her voice cracked, but she didn't back down. "You could walk away, Ethan. None of this is your burden. You don't owe me anything." The truth was complicated. He could walk away. He should walk away. But something in him, something he hadn't felt in years, had already welded him to their fate. He thought of the baby's cry echoing through the smoke of Grace's trembling arms, refusing to let go of Luna, tearing into men twice her size without hesitation. It had bound him, shackled him to a choice he didn't make consciously, but couldn't undo. "You're wrong," Ethan said softly, pulling the strap of the bag across his chest. "I do owe you. You pulled me back into something I thought I'd lost. And I'm not about to let Richard erase it." Her eyes softened, though fear still cloaked them. She said nothing as he offered his hand, helping her rise. Minutes later, they slipped out a back exit, the cold night swallowing them whole. Snow fell in thick sheets, masking the streets in silence. Patrol cars circled the front, but the alley behind the hospital was deserted, save for flickering lamps and Luna's heavy paw prints in the fresh powder. They moved quickly, Ethan leading with tense precision. Grace clutching Hope close, Luna padding ahead like a sentinel carving a path through darkness. The storm masked their escape, but it also cloaked their enemies. Every shadow seemed alive. Every passing car felt like a threat. As they trudged through the snow toward Ethan's truck parked 3 blocks away, Grace's voice wavered through the wind. "He won't stop, will he?" No, Ethan admitted. "Not until he has what he wants, and what he wants is her." Grace's arms tightened around Hope until the baby squirmed in protest. Tears streaked her cheeks, freezing almost instantly. "Ethan, you don't understand. There's more." She cut herself off, biting down on the words. Ethan halted mid-step, his boots sinking into the snow. He turned, staring at her with a sharpness that pierced deeper than the cold. "What aren't you telling me, Grace?" She shook her head quickly, too quickly. "It doesn't matter right now. We just need to get away." "No." His voice was iron. "It does matter. If you're holding something back, if there's a piece of this puzzle I don't see, it could get us all killed. I need the truth." Her lips trembled. She opened them, closed them, and for a heartbeat, Ethan saw something raw flash through her eyes. Fear, guilt, shame. Then she looked away. "Not now. Please." He wanted to push, to drag the truth out of her by force if necessary. But the wind howled around them, and Luna suddenly froze, hackles raised, ears pinned. A growl reverberated from her chest. Ethan's instinct screamed, "Move!" Headlights cut through the snow, sweeping across the alley. A black SUV slowed at the far end, tires crunching over ice. Grace gasped, clutching Hope tighter. Ethan grabbed her arm and pulled her into the shadows. Luna pressed tight against his leg, her body taut and ready. The SUV idled, prowling, searching. The windows were tinted, but Ethan didn't need to see the faces to know whose men they were. Richard's reach had already extended this far. They waited, breath frozen in their lungs, until the SUV rolled past and disappeared into the storm. Only then did Ethan dare to exhale. "Truck's 2 blocks up," he whispered. "Stay close. Don't make a sound." They moved again, slower now, every nerve tuned to danger. Luna padded in front, her head low, sniffing, scanning. She was more than muscle. She was intuition, reading threats Ethan couldn't see. Grace's eyes never left her, as though the dog's presence was the only anchor holding her together. At last the truck appeared, half buried under snow. Ethan yanked the door open, helping Grace into the back with Hope before tossing his bag across the seat. Luna leapt in after them, shaking snow from her coat. Ethan climbed behind the wheel, breath-ragged hands trembling as he turned the ignition. The engine groaned, then roared to life. Relief surged through him. But as he pulled onto the deserted street, a voice in his chest whispered what he refused to say aloud. They weren't outrunning Richard forever. This was only the beginning. For a while, silence filled the cab, broken only by the hum of tires over ice and the baby's occasional whimper. Grace sat with her head bowed, her hand stroking Hope's tiny back in steady, desperate rhythms. Luna lay curled against her legs, but her eyes never closed, amber and alert, staring out into the night as if waiting for the next battle. Ethan kept his gaze on the road, but the storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside him. Grace's hesitation gnawed at him. What secret was she guarding? What truth could be so damning she'd risk silence even now? And why, despite the danger, did he feel the fragile ember of something stirring between them again? It was madness to think about love, when death stalked them at every turn. Yet as Grace lifted her eyes, meeting his in the dim glow of the dashboard, something passed between them, a flicker, an unspoken thread. Fear bound them. Survival chained them. But beneath it all, an old warmth threatened to spark back to life, fragile yet undeniable. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter, his jaw clenched. He couldn't afford that distraction. Not now. Not when Richard was still out there hunting, waiting. And yet as Luna's steady breath filled the cab, as Hope's soft cries melted into sleep against her mother's chest, Ethan allowed himself a single dangerous thought. Maybe the storm hadn't taken everything from him after all. The rain had slowed into a misting drizzle by the time Ethan parked the borrowed sedan in the half-abandoned motel lot. but his hand still gripped the wheel, like it might bolt away from him. Grace sat in the passenger seat with Hope cradled close against her chest. Her head bowed, every strand of hair clinging damply to her cheeks. Luna paced the narrow back seat, restless. Her amber eyes trained on the window ears, twitching at every sound in the darkness beyond. For a few moments, none of them spoke, silence stretching into a near tangible weight. Then Ethan reached for the folder he had hidden under the driver's seat. He had found it back in the hospital records room before they fled. His fingers trembled as he flipped the cover open. Inside, scanned documents, notarized signatures, and medical case files. Some bore Richard Collins' name in bold type across the headers. Others contained redacted sections, but enough detail remained for Ethan's breath to catch. Grace noticed the shift in him. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, roughened by exhaustion and fear. Ethan glanced at her, then back to the file. "It's not just about Hope. Richard's hands are dirtier than I thought. He's been tied to drug trials gone wrong. Entire families ruined. Cover-ups. Payoffs. This," he jabbed a finger at the papers, "this could bring him down." Grace stiffened, hugging the baby tighter. Her lips trembled as she stared at the manila folder like it was a live grenade. She shook her head slowly, tears threatening. "I knew some of it, but not like this. He made me sign a non-disclosure agreement before Hope was born. More than that, Ethan, he threatened me. Said if I ever spoke, he had people who would make sure I disappeared. That's why I ran. That's why I left her in that box. Because it was the only way I thought she could survive him." The words shattered between them, heavy, jagged. Ethan's jaw clenched. The image of the infant freezing in the carton cut across his mind, colliding with Grace's broken confession. He wanted to rage at her, to tell her no excuse could justify abandonment. But in the same breath, he saw the bruises of fear etched into her, the wreckage Richard had left in her wake. Luna, as if sensing the tension, pressed her muzzle to Grace's arm, whimpering low. Grace reached instinctively to stroke the dog's fur, grounding herself in the warmth, and the baby shifted, sighing in her sleep. The fragile sound melted some of the steel in Ethan's chest. "We can't just run forever," he said finally, his voice rough. "Richard has power, yes, but he's human, and humans bleed. If you have proof, Grace, if this file is just the surface, we might have a chance to do more than hide." Her eyes lifted to him, wide and fearful, but threaded with a glimmer of something else, resolve. "You don't understand. He'll burn everything. He'll burn us. He has senators in his pocket, police on his payroll. He can twist any narrative. Then we twist it back." Ethan shot back, leaning closer. "We go public. We find someone untouchable, press prosecutors, whoever isn't already bought. We make him answer." The intensity in his voice startled her, and for a long beat, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "You sound like you've lost someone too." Ethan froze, breath shallow. Images flickered, a different winter, a different child. His wife Sarah, their son Caleb, gone in a car crash on a snow-slick highway while he was on duty too far to stop it. He had never spoken of it to anyone since. But Grace's words cracked something open, and for the first time he let the memory surface. "That's why I couldn't leave Hope there," he murmured, staring at the baby's tiny fingers curled against Grace's coat. "I know what it is to lose family. I couldn't watch it happen again." The confession drew tears to Grace's eyes, silent rivulets cutting down her cheeks. In that fragile space between grief and determination, a bond began to solidify, not just necessity, not just fear, but something deeper forged in shared loss. Luna huffed, laying her head against Ethan's arm as if sealing an unspoken pact. But the fragile moment fractured when headlights sliced across the motel lot. Ethan snapped the folder shut, instincts surging. He grabbed Grace's shoulder. "Get down." A black SUV rolled past, slowly, too slowly. Grace's pulse spiked. "It's him. It has to be Richard's men." They ducked low as the vehicle crawled by, pausing near the exit before disappearing into the night. The silence afterward was suffocating. Ethan exhaled hard. They're close. We don't have much time. He shoved the folder back into its hiding spot. We move before dawn, and Grace, no more secrets. If there's anything else you haven't told me, I need to know now. Her eyes locked on his, and for the first time she didn't look away. Then you should know the truth. Hope. She wasn't just his shame. She was his experiment. Ethan's blood chilled. What do you mean? Grace's voice shook, but she forced the words out. He used his own pharmaceutical trials on me, without consent. He said it was prenatal enhancement. He wanted to prove his company's drug line could create stronger, healthier infants. But the risks, God, Ethan, the risks could have killed her. When I found out, I confronted him. That's when he threatened me. The air between them crackled with horror. Hope shifted in Grace's arms, and Ethan felt his fists curl until his knuckles blanched. The baby wasn't just a daughter Richard wanted to hide. She was living evidence of his crimes. This isn't just personal anymore. Ethan whispered the words, scraping his throat. It's criminal, and he'll stop at nothing to bury it. Grace nodded, sobbing quietly. That's why I'm terrified. But maybe you're right. Maybe running isn't enough. Maybe it's time to fight. The seed was planted, transformation of fear into resolve. Ethan, Grace, Luna, and Hope were no longer just survivors of circumstance. They were carriers of a truth powerful enough to bring down a giant. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the motel shutters like a warning drum. The night pressed heavy, but inside the dim room, a fragile flame of defiance had been lit. It would not be easily extinguished. They would carry the secret, and soon the world would know. Snow churned under Ethan's boots as he pulled Grace along the narrow service road, hope bundled against her chest. The night was black, save for the pale glint of snowfields stretching endless beneath the moon. The storm had eased, but the air still crackled with a kind of violence. He could hear it in the silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Luna ran ahead, her coat a streak of shadow and silver, every muscle taut with vigilance. She would pause, ears pricked, nose twitching at the wind, then dart forward again. Ethan trusted her instincts more than his own. They had barely cleared the ridge when the first headlights slashed across the darkness. Engines growled behind them, several, not just one. Grace's breath broke into shallow gasps. Ethan yanked her closer to the tree line. "They found us," she whispered. The words hung like frost. A spotlight flared from the pursuing SUVs, slicing through branches, illuminating snowflakes like falling shards of glass. Shouts echoed Richard's men, their voices laced with hunger, the promise of capture. Gunfire cracked in the distance, bullets tearing into bark, hissing through the cold air. "Move!" Ethan barked, pushing Grace forward. She stumbled but clutched hope tighter, determination etched on her pale face. The chase became a nightmare of sound and motion, tires spinning in drifts, men shouting, dogs snarling from cages strapped to vehicle beds. Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't outrun engines forever. They had to vanish. Down there, he hissed, spotting a frozen creek glimmering faintly in moonlight. They scrambled down the embankment, sliding into the half-frozen bedwater, crusted with ice crackling beneath their feet. Shots rang out again. One bullet snapped a branch inches from Grace's head. She ducked, crying out, shielding Hope with her own body. And then Luna made her move. She bounded up the bank, throwing herself between the gunman and her family. The men shouted in surprise, firing wildly. Snow exploded in violent bursts. Ethan's heart clenched as one shot found its mark. Luna yelped, the sound ripping through the night like a knife. She staggered but held her ground, teeth bared, a wall of fur and fury. Luna Grace's scream shredded the storm-swept silence. She collapsed beside the dog, clutching Hope with one arm, reaching with the other. Luna's flank was darkened, blood staining the snow beneath her. Ethan dropped beside them, chest heaving, every instinct torn between fury and despair. He pressed a hand to the wound, feeling the warmth gush against his palm. Luna's eyes flickered, but never left Grace and Hope. Even in pain, her body curled protectively around the child. Gunfire kept coming, snapping trees and ricocheting off stone. But for Ethan, time narrowed to the sound of Grace sobbing the dog's labored breaths, the cry of a baby startled by the chaos. Grace's face was twisted in anguish as she cradled Luna's head. "Stay with me. Please don't leave us. You've saved us, don't go now." Her cries weren't just words, but raw, primal grief pouring from every wound life had inflicted. The audience would feel it the way her scream carried the weight of every mother, every loss, every desperate plea for mercy in a merciless world. Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to promise Grace that Luna would live, but the truth hung heavier than the night. The dog had given everything for them. Another bullet struck the ice nearby, shattering it into deadly shards. Ethan snapped back into soldier mode. His eyes burned with clarity. They could not keep running, not anymore. Richard's reach was endless, his cruelty boundless. Tonight had proven it. He rose slowly, fists clenched around the rifle he'd grabbed from the SUV earlier. His voice was iron when he spoke. "This ends tonight." Grace looked up, tears streaming down her face, her arms wrapped around both Hope and Luna. Ethan, no, he cut in his tone, sharp but steady. "If we keep running, more of us will die." Luna knew that. "She gave us a chance. I won't waste it hiding." The snow hissed as more rounds hit the creek bed. Ethan's decision hardened in his bones. They had been prey too long. It was time to turn to strike back. He crouched beside Grace, pressed his forehead to hers for a fleeting moment. "Stay low. Keep Hope warm. Hold on to her. I'll draw them away." Grace shook her head violently, clutching his sleeve. "Don't you dare leave me now." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm not leaving. I'm fighting for her, for Luna, for you." The words carried more than strategy. They carried the confession of every emotion he had buried under duty and grief. Grace's hand lingered on his trembling but unwilling to let go. Finally, she nodded through her tears. "Then make it count." Luna whimpered softly, and Grace bent to press her lips to the dog's forehead. Blood stained her hands, but she didn't care. In that moment, every wall inside her crumbled. Luna had been more than a protector. She had been a bridge between fear and hope, between survival and love. Ethan rose into the storm of bullets, his figure carved against the white glare of snow and headlights. He raised the rifle shoulders, squared rage and purpose burning in equal measure. The hunters thought they had cornered prey. They didn't realize they had awakened something else entirely. Snow muffled sound, but the first crack of Ethan's return fire thundered across the valley like judgment. A gunman fell, another cursed ducking behind an SUV. Engines revved, tires spun, chaos erupted. Grace clung to Luna and Hope in the shadow of the frozen creek, every shot ringing like a drumbeat of defiance. Ethan moved with brutal precision, a man no longer fleeing, but reclaiming his ground. Each step forward was an answer to every threat Richard had ever made. The night that had begun in terror shifted into something raw, electrifying, inevitable. Blood had been spilled, Luna's the most loyal of them all, and her sacrifice demanded an answer. Ethan gave it with every pull of the trigger. The snowstorm swallowed sound and breath. But one truth cut through the chaos. They would not run anymore. They would fight. The snow had not yet melted from the chaos of the chase when Ethan made his choice. Running was over. The silence after the storm was too sharp, too fragile, broken only by Grace's quiet sobs and Luna's ragged breathing. Hope slept fitfully in her mother's arms, unaware that every shadow carried danger. Ethan stood by the window of the safe house. They had stumbled into an abandoned ranger's cabin perched above the valley. His hands rested on the battered laptop he'd salvaged, its screen glowing with files Grace had hidden for years. Records of falsified trials, manipulated patient deaths, silenced whistleblowers, all signed off or buried under Richard's command. Each document was a nail in the coffin of the empire Richard had built on blood. Grace hovered nearby, her face pale, her body trembling but her eyes fierce. "He ruined so many lives," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And he made me sign that silence agreement, threatened to kill me if I ever spoke. I thought hiding was the only way to keep Hope safe." Ethan turned to her, jaw tight. "Not anymore. These files don't just expose him, they destroy him. And he knows it. That's why he'll come harder. But if we wait, if we keep this locked away, he wins. She shook her head, clutching hope tighter. If we go public, he'll strike back. He'll use everything. He'll come for her. Ethan crouched so his eyes met Grace's. His voice was low, steady, as if speaking from a place carved in steel. Then let him come. We're done running. We put this out, we shine a light so bright he can't hide. By the time he tries to touch you, the world will already know. Grace looked at Luna, who lay on the floor. Flank bandaged and still bleeding slowly, her breath uneven, but her gaze unbroken. The dog raised her head at the sound of Hope's tiny cry, forcing herself upright despite the pain. The sight cracked something in Grace. If Luna could still fight, how could she not? She nodded. Do it. Within an hour, Ethan had uploaded the files to multiple secure channels, blasting them to journalists, watchdog groups, and every contact he trusted from his past life in the military. He added a short video, Grace's trembling but unflinching testimony, her face pale under the dim cabin light. Her voice telling the world what Richard had done, what he had forced her to endure, and how many lives were crushed under his empire. By the time the first news alerts lit up screens across the country, Richard knew. And when Richard knew, he acted. The gates of Richard's sprawling mountain estate groaned as black SUVs streamed through headlights, blazing across manicured snow. Inside, Richard paced the marble floor of his private study, eyes narrowing as televisions flashed with breaking news. Medical mogul under fire, allegations of human trials, patient deaths surface. Commentators speculated. Anchors whispered the word scandal, and photographs of Grace filled the screen, her face no longer hidden. Richard hurled a glass into the fire shards, bursting like shrapnel. His men stood tense, waiting for orders. Find her. Now. Richard snarled, his voice like acid. She's already burned me. I won't let her live long enough to finish it. Bring me the child if you have to. I'll make her regret ever crossing me. Ethan knew the strike was coming. He could feel it in the cold. But he also knew hiding would only stretch their suffering. If Richard wanted a confrontation, then Ethan would take it to his door. By midnight, they were moving. Ethan drove the stolen SUV with grim focus. Grace clutching Hope in the back seat, Luna lying at her feet, panting heavily, but refusing to stay behind. The road wound upward into the mountains, toward the fortress-like mansion where Richard reigned. Grace's hands shook as she stroked Luna's head. She can't fight like this, she whispered. Ethan glanced in the mirror. You don't tell a soul like hers when it's done. She'll make that choice. The headlights cut through snow as the mansion loomed massive, arrogant, lit like a beacon of power. Ethan parked in the shadows of the pines. He turned to Grace. Once we step in there, everything changes. You ready? Grace kissed Hope's forehead, tears streaking her cheeks. For her, for everyone he's hurt, I have to be. They moved as one, Ethan with his rifle, Grace, clutching Hope, Luna limping, but determined. Inside the mansion, Richard stood at the head of a grand staircase, his expression a mask of fury barely controlled. He had anticipated their arrival. His guards spread through the halls, weapons ready. Cameras lined the walls, broadcasting everything to the reporters who had been lured by the promise of a statement. Richard wanted control of the story to twist it back in his favor. But when Ethan kicked open the doors, dragging the blizzard's howl into the heart of the house, control slipped from Richard's grip. The crowd of journalists gasped, flashbulbs exploded. The villain and the victims were suddenly sharing the same stage. Richard spread his arms, feigning calm. Ah, the prodigal family returns. How touching. You've dragged a child into this circus, Grace. Do you really think anyone believes your lies? Grace stepped forward, voice trembling but strong. They're not lies. I signed your silence agreement because you threatened to kill me. But I kept the files, and now the world has them. A ripple ran through the reporters' cameras, clicking furiously. Richard's mask cracked for the briefest moment before he smirked, gesturing to his guards. Take the child. End this farce. The room froze as two armed men moved toward Grace, and then Luna moved. With a guttural snarl, she launched herself despite her wounds colliding with the nearest guard, teeth sinking into his arm. The man cried out, firing wildly, bullets sparking against marble. Reporters screamed, ducking for cover, but cameras stayed rolling. Grace shielded Hope, dropping to the floor while Ethan fired a precise shot, dropping the second guard before he could touch them. Chaos erupted the grand hall, filling with gunfire shouts and the piercing wails of terrified onlookers. Yet through it all, Luna fought like a storm incarnate, every ounce of her strength burning for one purpose: keep Hope safe. Richard shouted over the din, his mask finally torn away, rage twisting his face. "You stupid dog. You'll die like the rest of them." Ethan advanced his rifle, trained his voice low but carrying. "No, Richard. Tonight everyone sees you for what you are." Richard drew his own pistol, aiming at Grace. For a heartbeat, time hung suspended, Grace clutching her child. Luna staggering but lunging again, Ethan's finger tightening on the trigger. The shot that rang out was deafening. Cameras flashed. Reporters screamed. Richard dropped to his knees, his weapon clattering across marble. Blood stained his pristine suit. His empire, his facade, his control, all collapsing in one brutal instant under the eyes of the world. Ethan stood over him, chest-heaving weapon still raised. But he didn't fire again. He didn't need to. The world had already seen. Grace rose shakily, Hope wailing against her chest, tears streaming as she staggered to Ethan's side. Luna collapsed beside them, exhausted, her body trembling, but her eyes shining with victory. The room was chaos, journalists shouting, cameras flashing, guards dropping their weapons. The roar of justice finally breaching the walls of Richard's empire. And in the center of it all, Richard writhed, exposed, his voice breaking into desperate curses that only made his downfall more complete. Ethan pulled Grace close, one arm around her, and Hope the other, steadying Luna as she leaned against him. He looked into Grace's eyes, tired, tear-streaked, but unbroken. "It's over," he said. His voice was not triumphant, but resolute. Grace nodded, her tears falling onto Hope's face, her lips trembling as she whispered, "No, Ethan. It's just beginning." Because Richard's empire might have fallen, but the fight for justice, for healing, for rebuilding, for truth was only starting, and the world was finally watching. The courtroom was a cathedral of silence the morning Richard's trial began. The world had already judged him, yet here he was, seated in a tailored suit that no longer carried authority, only the stench of desperation. The cameras lining the oak-paneled chamber did not bend to his power anymore. They were eyes of a public hungry for truth. Every lens felt like a mirror Richard could not escape. Grace sat only a few rows behind the prosecution's table. Hope cradled in her arms. Ethan was beside her, his presence steady, his eyes fixed on Richard with the kind of cold fire that came from too many battles, both on foreign soil and in the shadow of Richard's empire. Luna was not in the room. Dogs weren't permitted inside, but Grace knew she was safe resting at the clinic after weeks of healing. The thought of Luna waiting outside, strong enough to walk again, was an anchor against the storm. The judge entered, robes, heavy gavel striking. Court is now in session. The people versus Richard Hale. The prosecutor rose, laying out the case in words sharp as glass. Fraud, human experimentation, coercion, intimidation, cover-ups that spanned decades. Every sentence was punctuated with evidence Ethan and Grace had risked their lives to bring forward. Emails, bank records, testimonies of silenced employees. And then came the video, the one Ethan had recorded of Grace in the safe house, trembling but unflinching as she told the world what Richard had done. Richard shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his hands clasped together as though prayer might save him. When his defense rose, their arguments sounded thin, hollow against the mountain of evidence. They painted him as a visionary, misunderstood, a victim of betrayal by his own family. But even as they spoke, the courtroom whispered. The audience wasn't buying it. Then it was Grace's turn. She walked to the stand with Ethan's hand briefly brushing hers, a silent transfer of strength. She held Hope close as she swore her oath, then placed her daughter gently in Ethan's arms while she spoke. Her voice carried the weight of years spent in hiding. She described the contracts Richard forced her to sign, the threats that had trapped her in silence the night she lay awake, terrified that if she spoke, her child would be stolen from her arms. Her words cracked, but did not break. And when she turned, looking Richard in the eye, her voice hardened. "You told me no one would ever believe me. That I was weak, that I was alone. But look around, Richard. The world believes me, and I'm not alone anymore." The gallery erupted in murmurs, the cameras flashing like lightning. Richard glared, his mask fracturing into raw hatred. But the damage was done. The trial stretched for days. Witnesses came forward, former employees, emboldened by Grace's courage, victims' families who had buried loved ones because of Richard's greed. Each testimony was a stone building a wall Richard could no longer climb. When the verdict finally came, the silence was suffocating. The foreman stood, voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The judge's gavel fell like thunder. "Richard Hale, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You have squandered your influence, violated your oath to humanity, and your empire is no more. May you live the rest of your days in the shadow of the lives you destroyed." Richard's face crumpled, not in remorse, but in rage. He shouted, spit flying, accusing Grace, accusing Ethan, blaming everyone but himself. Guards restrained him, dragging him from the courtroom as his curses echoed through marble halls. For the first time, Richard Hale was powerless. Grace didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She simply wept, holding hope tight, her tears falling not from victory, but from release. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, anchoring her as the storm finally broke. In the weeks that followed, the city transformed. The scandal had rocked every corner of society. News reports dissecting every detail, politicians scrambling to distance themselves. Survivors finding strength to speak at last. And at the center of it all stood Grace. The court formally restored her custody of Hope. The documents arrived on a quiet morning, signed by a judge who had seen too many families torn apart. Grace sat at the kitchen table of the small townhouse Ethan had rented, the paper trembling in her hands, her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "She's really mine again. No one can take her away." Ethan smiled, a rare softness breaking through his guarded exterior. "She was always yours, Grace. Now the world just admits it." Hope toddled across the living room, clutching Luna's toy in her small hands. She giggled when Luna, still limping, but stronger every day, gently tugged the toy away with her mouth tail wagging for the first time in weeks. The sight pulled a laugh from Grace's throat, light and free, as if some chain had finally been cut. Ethan watched them, mother-child, and the dog that had bled for them, and something in his chest ached. For years he had lived with ghosts, haunted by what he couldn't save. Now sitting here, he felt something he thought long lost, the fragile, terrifying hope of belonging. It didn't take long for Luna's story to spread. Reporters who had once chased scandal now told tales of loyalty and sacrifice. Photos of the wounded dog carrying Hope through the snowstorm went viral, her name whispered with reverence. When Luna was finally strong enough to walk unaided, the city honored her. A ceremony was held at the central square, crowds gathering in the cold air, banners unfurled with her image. Grace carried Hope onto the stage, Ethan at her side, as the mayor placed a medal on Luna's collar. "She is more than a hero," the mayor declared, voice carrying across the crowd. "She is a reminder of what loyalty, courage, and love mean in a world that too often forgets." The crowd erupted in applause, children cheering, adults wiping tears. Luna barked once, a deep, steady sound that sent ripples of joy through the gathering. Grace knelt beside her, whispering into her fur, "You saved us, Luna. You saved me. And I'll never forget." For the first time, Grace believed it wasn't just survival they were living anymore. It was the start of something new. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, in quiet moments. It came when Grace woke in the night, heart racing from dreams of Richard's threats, only to find Ethan awake too, keeping watch, whispering, "You're safe. I'm here." It came when Hope, once wary of strangers, began to laugh freely in playgrounds, her small hand gripping Luna's fur like an anchor. It came when Ethan let himself put down the bottle he had clung to for years, choosing instead to sit with Grace on the porch, watching sunsets without needing to drown the silence. It came in the day Grace found the courage to visit the graves of those lost to Richard's empire, leaving flowers not just for them, but for the version of herself she had once been, the woman who thought she was powerless. Piece by piece, the broken edges of their lives knit together. One evening, as snowflakes drifted down once more, Ethan sat by the fire with Grace and Hope curled against him, Luna's head heavy on his knee. Grace looked at him, her eyes no longer haunted, and whispered, "We're a family now, aren't we?" Ethan hesitated. The word family had always felt foreign, dangerous. But as he looked at her, at the child sleeping in her arms, at the dog, breathing steadily at his side, he realized it was the only word that fit. "Yeah," he said softly. "We are." The fire crackled. Outside, the world kept spinning, bruised but alive. And inside that small home, healing grew not as a sudden miracle, but as a steady, unyielding truth. The story that began with betrayal, with loss and fear, had found its way to something greater. Not perfection, not an erasure of pain, but a family forged in fire, bound by the kind of love that could outlast even the darkest winters. And for Grace, for Ethan, for Hope, and for Luna, that was enough. Years passed, though not in silence. Time left its marks, as it always does, not only on faces, not only in the quiet thinning of hair or the soft deepening of lines around the eyes, but in the way lives settle into rhythms once unthinkable. For Grace, the woman who had once lived in the shadow of Richard's threats, the years became a slow unfurling. What had begun as survival reshaped itself into living, and then astonishingly into joy. Hope grew at the center of it all. No longer a fragile child clinging to her mother's trembling hand, she became a girl of light and laughter, her presence proof that darkness could never wholly claim what was meant to shine. She had her mother's determination, Ethan's quiet strength, and Luna's fierce loyalty braided into her very being. Teachers marveled at her creativity, her ability to see the world in colors no one else could find. Ethan had become more than a protector. He was the anchor who steadied their days, the man who repaired the leaky roof before storms and read bedtime stories with a voice steadier than he ever believed it could be. The years softened his edges, though they never dulled his vigilance. He had once lived as if waiting for the next war, but with Grace and Hope, with Luna, padding silently at his heel, he discovered a war could end without him losing himself. He carried scars, yes, but they no longer dictated his future. And Luna, dear Luna, was no longer the limping survivor of the storm, but a legend. The medal she had received years ago hung in the hallway of their home, tarnished but gleaming in memory. Strangers still stopped Grace on the street, sometimes recognizing the great shepherd with silver in her fur. Children reached out timidly, and Luna, ever gentle, leaned her head into their palms, as though she knew she was no longer simply a dog, but a living story. One winter, when Hope turned 10, snow fell heavy again, blanketing the city in white silence. Grace stood at the window of their home, watching Hope and Luna chase each other through the drifts in the yard. Laughter and barks echoed into the night, the sound carrying a warmth the cold could not touch. Ethan joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. For a moment, Grace thought back to that first storm when everything seemed lost, when Richard's shadow loomed over every step. Now, standing here, watching the life they had carved from wreckage, she allowed herself to whisper the truth. "We made it." Ethan kissed her temple. "We did." Years turned again. Hope grew taller, braver. She became a teenager with paint-stained fingers and a sketchbook that never left her side. The walls of their home filled with her drawings, portraits of Grace, laughing of Ethan fixing the truck, of Luna standing sentinel at the edge of the woods behind their house. She painted storms too, but in each storm there was always light breaking through the clouds. One evening, Hope sat cross-legged before the fireplace canvas, propped on her knees. Luna lay beside her head, resting against the girl's thigh, eyes closing, as though the rhythm of brushstrokes lulled her to sleep. Grace watched from the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her heart swelling with something so full it ached. "What are you painting tonight, sweetheart?" she asked. Hope didn't look up, only smiled faintly as her brush swept across the canvas. Luna. But not just Luna. Ethan glanced up from his book, brow raised. "What do you mean?" Hope finally turned the canvas toward them. On it was Luna, her fur rendered in strokes of gray and white eyes, bright with life. But from her back stretched wings, vast, luminous, feathered in shades of gold and silver. Like light itself had decided to wear a form. Luna, as Hope saw her, was not just a dog. She was guardian protector angel. "She carried me through the storm," Hope said softly, her voice breaking with memory. She was too young to fully remember, yet would never forget. "She's always carried us. So I wanted to paint her the way she really is." Grace's throat tightened. Tears blurred her vision as she rose, kneeling beside her daughter, touching the edge of the canvas as though afraid it might burn her fingers. Ethan's chest rose with a breath he didn't release. For all his years, all his battles, he had never seen a truth captured so clearly. When the painting was finished, they placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, the heart of their home. Its colors glowed in the firelight, and Luna, lifting her head, seemed almost to recognize herself there. She wagged her tail once, slow and steady, before resting again, as if satisfied the world finally saw her the way Hope did. The years that followed did not erase struggle. Life never does. There were still nights. Grace woke with the echo of Richard's voice in her dreams. Still days when Ethan fought with memories of the war, still vet visits where they feared Luna's age might finally be catching her. But in those moments, they leaned on each other. No longer fractured souls surviving in isolation, they were family. And family, real family, carried weight together. Hope thrived. She grew into a young woman with eyes full of wonder and hands that could coax beauty from paint, clay, pencil, anything she touched. Her teachers said she had the gift of vision, the ability to turn pain into art loss, into color, silence, into story. At her high school art exhibition, Grace stood in the gallery, hand gripping Ethan's as she stared at the centerpiece of Hope's collection. It was the painting of Luna, with wings enlarged and framed, displayed beneath a single spotlight. Beneath it a placard read, "Guardian of the Storm." Visitors stopped before it, hushed reverent. Some cried, some smiled. And Grace, tears sliding freely down her cheeks, realized that this was what survival had been for. Not to simply endure, but to give Hope the chance to create, to shine, to tell the world their story in ways Grace herself could never fully articulate. Luna, older now, rested on the floor beside the painting, eyes half closed, as though she knew the honor belonged to her. On a quiet evening, not long after, as twilight painted the sky in bruised purple and gold, Grace found herself sitting by the fire with Ethan once more. Hope was upstairs working on another project, her music drifting faintly through the floorboards. Luna lay curled on the rug, her breathing deep, her fur touched with silver. Grace reached for Ethan's hand. "Do you ever think about how different it could have been?" He didn't answer at once. His eyes lingered on the flames on the painting above the mantel, on the wings that seemed to shimmer even in shadow. Finally he spoke, voice low. "Every day. But then I remember we're here, and that's enough." Grace leaned against him, letting his words settle in her bones. She thought of the message Hope's painting carried, the truth that had become their own love, and loyalty had turned their darkest nights into something survivable, then into something more, into light. The last snowfall of that winter came, heavy, thick flakes cascading under the glow of the porch light. Hope stepped outside with her coat wrapped tight, Luna following slowly. Her pace measured now with age, but her spirit unbroken. Grace watched from the doorway as her daughter tilted her head back, catching flakes on her tongue, laughing. Luna barked softly, wagging her tail, and for a moment Grace saw not the years that had passed, but the storm that had begun it all the night, when Luna had carried her daughter through death's teeth. Only this time the snow did not terrify. It shimmered. It blessed. Hope turned cheeks flushed with cold, her eyes alight, "Mom, Ethan, come out, it's beautiful." And so they did. Together they stood in the falling snow, a family carved not by blood alone, but by choice, by sacrifice, by love that refused to die. Ethan slipped his arm around Grace's shoulders. Hope leaned against her mother's side, and Luna pressed close, as if gathering them all within the circle of her protection, one final time. Grace closed her eyes. She breathed the cold air deep into her lungs, letting it burn, letting it remind her she was alive. When she opened them again, she whispered the truth aloud. "The storm is over. We're home." Above them, in the window of their home, the painting of Luna with wings glowed in the firelight, a sentinel watching over them. And though the world outside would always hold shadows, Grace knew this love and loyalty could turn even the coldest, darkest night into light. Hope's laughter, Ethan's steady strength, Luna's eternal guardianship, these were her dawn. The story that began in betrayal and loss ended not with vengeance, but with a legacy of love. A family reborn, a future luminous. For in the end, hope itself was the gift they had carried through every storm.